Nora Hudson never thought she would inherit anything more complicated than her late aunt's collection of antique books. Yet the moment she stepped onto the weathered porch of the old stone house on East Morrow Hill, she sensed that this place carried a history that refused to be silent. The property sat slightly above the rest of the neighborhood, surrounded by a tangle of oak roots and neglected ivy, as if nature itself had decided to guard it from the encroaching modern development below. The houses in the valley were all freshly painted, square-shaped, and identical, each with manicured lawns and polite little fences, the kind of suburb that pretended harmony was the same thing as peace. Nora's home was an anomaly, older by almost a century, with thick limestone walls and tall windows that still bore the wavy glass of another era. She had come here to escape the numbing repetition of city life, to finish her research on early American legal linguistics and perhaps rediscover some sense of solitude that didn't feel like exile. The house, with its uneven floors and faint smell of cedar, promised her that kind of silence. The neighbors were cordial at first. A few stopped by with baskets of muffins and carefully phrased curiosity about whether she planned to restore the property according to community standards. The question sounded benign, but carried a tone she couldn't quite define, something between advice and a warning. Nora, polite but self-contained, thanked them and explained that the house wasn't part of their homeowners association, that her aunt had purchased the land long before the subdivision existed. The smiles that followed were brittle, polite, and full of a tension that made her feel she had just violated an unwritten rule. Within weeks, the friendly gestures stopped. The neighborhood's neatly dressed residents now looked through her rather than at her. The mail began arriving late, sometimes opened, sometimes with envelopes that bore faint imprints as though someone had pressed a copy of her address elsewhere. One evening, she found an HOA newsletter tucked into her mailbox, though her name wasn't on the mailing list. The letter mentioned a continuing effort to bring all properties under shared governance for the good of the community. The phrasing made her skin prickle. It sounded less like civic enthusiasm and more like a claim of ownership. She dismissed it at first, chalking it up to bureaucratic overreach. But one morning, a large white envelope appeared on her porch with her full name printed in bold type and a return address marked Hawthorne Ridge Homeowners Association. Inside was a formal notice written in the polite but lethal language of legal correspondence. It declared that her property was in violation of community code standards, that she had failed to maintain the exterior facade in compliance with aesthetic ordinances, and that unpaid dues had accumulated over 36 months. Nora reread the letter 3 times, each word more surreal than the last. She wasn't a member of any association. She hadn't agreed to their terms, hadn't attended their meetings, hadn't even known they existed before moving here. Yet the tone of the letter left no space for disbelief. It spoke with the calm certainty of authority, not request. The closing line was what chilled her. Failure to respond within 21 days will constitute voluntary relinquishment of property rights as outlined in Article 9 of the Hawthorne Ridge Charter. For a long moment, she stood by the window, looking down the hill at the rows of pristine homes whose shutters all matched in color and proportion. Somewhere in that symmetry, she thought, someone had decided that her house didn't belong. She folded the letter back into the envelope and placed it on the table beside the cold cup of tea she had forgotten hours ago. The world outside seemed unnervingly still, as if waiting for her reaction, and as she listened to the faint hum of sprinklers from the manicured lawns below, Nora realized that her solitude was no longer a refuge. It was the first stage of siege. The morning after receiving the letter, Nora drove to the small administrative office listed on the envelope, a one-story brick building wedged between a dentist's clinic and a boutique that sold overpriced scented candles. She had rehearsed what she would say, calm, factual, professional, but as soon as she stepped through the glass doors and felt the heavy air of the place, that confidence thinned like mist. Behind the reception desk sat a woman with a lacquered smile and the kind of posture that communicated both disinterest and control. Nora handed her the letter and asked for clarification. The woman scanned the document, then looked up with mechanical politeness and said, "You'll need to speak with Mr. Finch, our chair. Do you have an appointment?" Nora didn't. She waited 47 minutes in a lobby that smelled faintly of lemon polish and new carpet, surrounded by framed photographs of clean sidewalks and identical houses labeled Community Excellence Awards. When Walter Finch finally emerged, he looked exactly as she had imagined, a man built entirely out of orderliness, his tie perfectly symmetrical, his expression carved in the careful neutrality of someone used to hearing only his own voice. He greeted her with a handshake that lingered too long and led her into a small meeting room where a map of the neighborhood hung across an entire wall. It was dotted with colored pins, each labeled by lot number. Nora's property, Lot 3A, was marked with a red pin. "So, Miss Hudson," Finch began, "we've been expecting you." The way he said it made her skin crawl. She placed the letter on the table and asked how her house could possibly fall under their jurisdiction. Finch adjusted his glasses and replied as if explaining something obvious to a stubborn child. "Your property was listed as the original registration site for Hawthorne Ridge, back in 1994. The charter identifies your address as the administrative hub. Therefore, all subsequent land parcels fall under the same covenant." Nora blinked, unsure whether to laugh or argue. "That's impossible," she said. "My aunt owned that property since the 70s. She never joined your association, and there's no record of her giving permission for anything like that." Finch smiled, a slow, patient smile that seemed to come from someone who enjoyed being contradicted. "It's not about joining, Miss Hudson. It's about jurisdiction. The association was founded with your address as its legal base of operation. Technically speaking, Hawthorne Ridge wouldn't exist without your land." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle like dust. "So you see, you are part of it, whether you wish to be or not." Nora's pulse quickened, but she kept her tone even. "If that's true, then you're using my property illegally. You can't claim administrative rights over land you don't own." Finch tilted his head, studying her like a curiosity. "Ownership is a flexible term when it comes to community law. I'm sure you'll find that the courts interpret these matters with nuance." He opened a folder and slid a document toward her. It was a copy of the original HOA charter, printed on faded blue stationery. Her address stood clearly beneath the words, "Registered Office." The date matched the year the association had been founded, and the signature at the bottom belonged to someone named Arthur Hudson, her great-uncle, long deceased, who had apparently served as a witness during the registration. Her stomach tightened. Finch leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make it sound confidential. "We understand this situation is delicate. If you'd like to resolve it quietly, the board is willing to offer a settlement. Pay the outstanding dues and agree to comply with aesthetic regulations, and this entire misunderstanding disappears." Nora could almost hear the practiced rhythm in his speech, the well-oiled mechanism of intimidation disguised as diplomacy. She stood, her hands trembling slightly, and said she would consult her attorney. His smile did not waver. "Of course," he said softly. "Just remember, time is an important factor. Every day you delay, the fines increase." She walked out of the building into the sharp midday light, the world spinning slightly around her. She didn't have an attorney. She barely knew any local law firms. The drive back up the hill felt longer than usual, and when she parked in front of her house, the mailbox was already open again, as if someone had checked it in her absence. Inside, she found another letter, no return address this time, containing a single page that read, "Your cooperation ensures harmony." There was no signature, only the HOA logo embossed faintly in the corner. That night she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house sounded amplified. Every gust of wind across the chimney felt like movement in the walls. Around 2 a.m, she lit a candle and began sorting through the papers her aunt had left behind, hoping for some clue about this Arthur Hudson mentioned in the charter. Most of the boxes contained old correspondence and property tax receipts, but near the bottom of one she found a folder marked Zoning Dispute, 1994. Inside were yellowed letters between her aunt and the county clerk's office, discussing a proposed boundary realignment that never went through because the association hadn't provided the required land survey. One letter mentioned that the proposed administrative center on the Hudson parcel lacks written authorization. Nora stared at that line until her eyes blurred. It meant the association's entire foundation was built on a procedural void, something that had been conveniently ignored for decades. By dawn, she was trembling not from fear, but from a cold, precise anger. This wasn't about unpaid dues or appearances. It was about power, built quietly on the assumption that no one would ever check the paperwork. As the first light touched the tops of the identical roofs below, Nora made a silent vow. If her land was truly the cornerstone of their empire, she would make sure that empire collapsed. 3 days after discovering the zoning file, Nora returned from the university library to find 2 uniformed workers unloading wooden stakes and bright orange tape at the edge of her driveway. They moved with bureaucratic precision, marking invisible lines through her front yard while pretending not to see her standing there. When she asked what they were doing, one of them replied without looking up, "Boundary survey for community improvement," before driving another stake into the soil. She demanded paperwork, authorization, anything, but they merely pointed toward the bottom of the hill, where a white SUV idled with its hazard lights on. Behind the tinted window sat Walter Finch, watching with the detached interest of a chess player moving his first pawn. Nora felt her pulse pounding in her ears as she strode down the hill, the gravel crunching beneath her boots, but by the time she reached the car, Finch had already rolled down the window with an expression of manufactured calm. "We're simply verifying the perimeters," he said smoothly. "Standard procedure. There's been some confusion about where your property ends and the communal easement begins." Nora gestured sharply toward the stakes. "You're trespassing on private land. You have no right to do that." Finch's smile barely shifted. "On the contrary, Miss Hudson. The charter allows the association to conduct maintenance and boundary checks on all registered lots. It's part of our due diligence." He paused as if to add emphasis. "Including yours." The deliberate provocation almost made her laugh. It was too absurd to be real. She turned away, but before she could speak, Finch leaned slightly forward and said in a tone that was both casual and ominous, "You know, I once admired this house. It's rare these days, authentic, full of history. I'd hate to see it become a legal liability for you." For a moment, she couldn't tell if it was a threat or a warning disguised as sympathy. The next morning, she awoke to find her mailbox removed from its post and replaced with a standard HOA-approved unit in dull beige metal. A notice was taped to her door stating that unauthorized exterior fixtures have been corrected to comply with community safety standards. She tore it down, her hands shaking, and realized that her refusal to play along had triggered something larger than a bureaucratic misunderstanding. It had turned into an orchestrated campaign to force her into submission. Within days, small disturbances began to multiply. Her water pressure dropped inexplicably, and when she contacted the municipal utility, they told her the HOA had filed a maintenance request to upgrade residential meters. Her garbage collection was suddenly suspended due to non-payment, even though her bank statements showed the opposite. Every institution she called redirected her back to the association's management representative. It was as though the town itself had conspired to funnel all communication through one controlling voice. One evening, Nora noticed a van parked across from her gate with its headlights off, the outline of two figures visible inside. They didn't move when she stared. They simply waited until she turned away and then drove off slowly, as if to make their presence known rather than hidden. When she mentioned it to the local sheriff, he shrugged and said the HOA often hired private security for neighborhood safety patrols. The implication was clear. They were watching her legally. The psychological pressure began to take its toll. Nora's work suffered, her lectures became distracted, and she found herself forgetting simple words, like her mind was being gradually filled with static. Each evening she returned home expecting to find some new violation notice or another correction. One afternoon, while checking the mail, she noticed that one of the survey stakes from earlier had been moved several feet closer to her house. She followed the line it created and realized it cut directly through her kitchen wall. That night she dreamed of the house being slowly eaten by invisible borders, her walls sliced into grids of legality she couldn't see but somehow owed. Desperation turned to methodical defiance. She hired a private land assessor, a retired county surveyor named Darrell, who still carried the cautious integrity of someone used to being ignored by people in power. After 2 long days of measuring, he confirmed what she suspected. The HOA's survey lines were fabricated. The official records at the county office still listed her original boundaries, untouched and valid. When she asked if he would testify, he hesitated and said quietly, "I've seen them do this before. They redraw maps, refile deeds, claim it's an update. By the time anyone notices, the paperwork looks official." Nora paid him double and asked for a notarized statement anyway. 2 nights later, her mailbox was vandalized again, this time ripped out entirely, leaving a hole in the ground like a wound. She found a single page tucked under her doormat, printed in the same bureaucratic tone as before. Unauthorized activity detected. Cooperation is mandatory. There was no logo, no signature, only the faint smell of toner and a water stain that looked suspiciously like a fingerprint. It was then she realized the association didn't need physical violence to destroy someone. All it required was persistence, repetition, and the erosion of certainty. She wasn't losing her property yet. She was losing her sense of reality, one policy at a time. But even as the pressure grew, something inside her hardened. She began photographing every notice, recording dates, compiling timelines. If they wanted to bury her under paperwork, she would build her defense from the same material. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about forcing her compliance. The pattern was too deliberate, too coordinated. There was something else buried beneath their obsession with her house, something they couldn't afford to let her see. And every red stake they planted in her soil seemed to point toward a truth she hadn't yet uncovered but was certain existed. Somewhere deep under the foundation of the land they all claimed to own. By the 2nd month of the conflict, Nora had begun to live in a rhythm dictated entirely by intrusion. Every morning she would check the perimeter of her property as if inspecting a battlefield after an unseen skirmish. The fence line bore new markers. The grass carried tire tracks that didn't belong to her, and sometimes, inexplicably, she would find a plastic tag tied to a branch with a code written in fine black ink, the kind used on official inspection forms. At first she collected them and stacked them in a box, but soon they became too numerous to keep track of, so she left them hanging where they appeared, like the silent badges of an occupation. Her only consistent ally was the quiet persistence of her own research. While the HOA tightened its hold on the neighborhood through endless notices and administrative harassment, she spent her nights buried in digital archives and scanned legal records, tracing every filing connected to the foundation of Hawthorne Ridge. What she found was not a simple mistake or bureaucratic confusion, but a deliberate chain of omissions spanning nearly 30 years. The original charter, signed in 1994, had listed her property as the central office, but the legal framework surrounding it had never been updated when the surrounding land was developed. Each subsequent amendment simply copied the same foundational address without verifying ownership, meaning the HOA's entire existence was parasitic on a single clerical assumption. It was an elegant form of theft, paperwork disguised as permanence. But the more Nora read, the stranger it became. The earliest drafts of the charter referred to a trustee lease of the Hudson property, a document that did not exist in any county record. She searched for days, combing through microfilms and digitized newspapers until she found a small notice buried in the classifieds of a local paper from 1993. Notice of intent to establish residential development zone. Administrative seat, Hudson Estate, Morrow Hill. No signature, no contact information, only a legal description that matched her land exactly. Whoever had filed it had done so under the name Community Trust, an entity that dissolved a year later. The entire HOA had grown from the ghost of that filing, using it as a seed from which to sprout legitimacy. When she shared this discovery with Darrell, the surveyor, he simply whistled and said, "That's a phantom charter. I've seen it once before. Back in Tennessee, I think. A developer registers a property under a temporary trust, builds around it, and never dissolves the connection. Technically, it means you're the foundation stone of the whole association." Nora stared at him, stunned by the absurd simplicity of it. So if that trust was invalid, then the HOA doesn't legally exist, he finished quietly. But proving that will be hell. They'll bury you under procedural filings before they let that come to light. His prediction proved prophetic. 2 days later, she received a certified letter from the HOA's legal department accusing her of obstruction of governance and defamation of administrative integrity. The wording was intentionally vague but intimidating enough to imply potential civil action. Yet the threat only deepened her resolve. She had found a chink in their armor, and she intended to widen it until the whole structure collapsed. The turning point came one cold afternoon when she visited the county registrar's office in person, hoping to obtain a certified copy of the original 1994 filing. The clerk, a thin man with tired eyes, pulled the microfilm with visible reluctance, muttering that the records were incomplete. When the image finally appeared on the screen, Nora felt her stomach twist. The signature on the charter wasn't her great-uncle's at all. The name was spelled correctly, but the handwriting was an imitation. Subtle, almost perfect, but with one fatal inconsistency. The H in Hudson was written in a style that only appeared in later documents, not in any of the older letters her family had preserved. Someone had forged the foundational signature decades ago. She printed the image and stood there for a long time, the hum of the microfilm reader loud in the small room, as if the machine itself was aware of the revelation it had just delivered. Outside, the sky was turning gray, and by the time she drove back up the hill, the rain had begun to fall, steady and cold. At home, she laid the papers across the dining table like evidence from a crime scene. Her reflection stared back at her from the glossy surface of the printout, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. But behind her own image was the faint outline of a system built on deceit. She realized then that the HOA didn't merely overstep its boundaries. It was founded on a fraud, one that had been quietly perpetuated through every new homeowner's signature, every monthly due, every approval form. Their authority was an illusion that became real only because no one dared to question it. She understood the psychological brilliance of it. If you convince enough people to believe in the same lie, it stops being a lie. The next morning, Nora called the state's real estate commission to request an official investigation. The operator transferred her 5 times before disconnecting without explanation. When she tried again, she was told the file was under review. Within hours, she received a new letter from the HOA, this one handwritten and unsigned, warning her that interfering with ongoing community operations may result in personal liability. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. She felt a chill, not of fear, but of awareness. Someone inside the county office was leaking her activity to the association. That night she sat in the dark, the only light coming from the lamp above the table, staring at the forged signature until the ink patterns seemed to shift. It struck her how fragile ownership really was, how quickly it could dissolve under the pressure of collective fiction. Land, after all, was just a line on paper, and whoever controlled the paper controlled the truth. The irony wasn't lost on her. A woman who spent her career analyzing the power of language was now trapped inside a sentence written 30 years ago. Yet amid the quiet rage, a strange clarity emerged. If the HOA's existence depended on her land being its legal base, then she wasn't their problem, she was their keystone. And if that keystone cracked, the entire structure would crumble. As the wind howled outside and rain streaked the windows, she whispered to herself, "Let them build their empire on lies. I'll make sure the ground beneath it disappears." From that moment, the struggle ceased to be about property or law. It became an act of intellectual revenge, a battle between a scholar of words and an institution that had built its dominion out of them. And in that realization, for the first time since the nightmare began, Nora felt something dangerously close to power. By early spring, the battle for the house had turned into something that resembled a siege in slow motion. Nora had grown used to the subtle rhythm of harassment. The notices left on her porch without envelopes, the phone calls that ended in silence when she answered, the way the neighborhood fell quiet whenever she stepped outside. What unsettled her most was not the hostility, but the precision. Every move felt calculated, as though the HOA knew exactly how far to push without crossing the line into illegality. They didn't want to destroy her outright. They wanted her to surrender voluntarily, to sign a document that would legitimize their claim once and for all. The association had filed an injunction against her for interfering with community development operations, which she knew was baseless, yet it forced her to appear in court to defend herself. The courthouse smelled of disinfectant and old paper, the kind of place where time felt slowed by bureaucracy. Walter Finch sat 3 rows ahead, immaculate in his tailored suit, his expression a mask of solemn professionalism. When the judge called the case, the HOA's attorney, a young man with a voice like polished glass, argued that Nora's refusal to comply with community standards was damaging the visual coherence of Hawthorne Ridge. It was absurd, almost comical, but his tone made it sound like a matter of national security. Nora's turn to speak came, and she laid out her findings in calm, deliberate detail. The forged signature, the phantom charter, the fraudulent trust. For a brief moment, the courtroom grew still, the judge's brow furrowing as he examined the photocopy she provided. Then, before she could elaborate, the attorney objected on grounds of irrelevance. Finch never looked at her, but she could sense the faint satisfaction emanating from him, the smug certainty that paperwork would triumph over truth. The judge postponed the ruling, citing the need for further verification, which Nora knew could mean months of bureaucratic stagnation. When she left the courthouse, Finch was waiting by the curb, pretending to check his phone. He didn't speak, only offered a thin smile that said everything words could not. That evening she returned home to find a construction crew parked outside her gate, unloading concrete bags and steel frames. When she confronted them, the foreman handed her a laminated permit signed by the HOA's maintenance division, authorizing the installation of a community access kiosk. The site for the kiosk was marked directly on her property line. She called the sheriff again, But this time, the dispatcher told her the association had obtained a temporary easement from the county. It felt like the ground beneath her house was dissolving one document at a time. Over the following week, the construction continued, accompanied by a relentless stream of letters citing pending reassessment of boundary jurisdiction. The noise of drills and generators bled into her sleep, until even silence carried an echo. Then, one morning, when the crew finally left, she saw what they had built. A small metal booth with tinted glass and a digital keypad, positioned like a sentinel facing her driveway. The sign above it read, "Property access, authorized, residents only." She stared at it for a long time, realizing that the structure wasn't functional. It was symbolic, a declaration that her land now belonged to them in spirit if not yet in law. The next day, her mailbox returned, bolted to the booth itself. She laughed aloud at the audacity of it, the kind of laughter that comes from the edge of disbelief. Later that week, she met again with Darryl, who warned her that the HOA had hired a corporate law firm from out of state. "They're going to try to get a declaratory judgment," he said quietly. "Something that says you're obstructing a recognized body. If they win, they can freeze your deed until the dispute's settled." Nora thanked him and drove straight to the county office, where she filed a counterclaim accusing the HOA of illegal occupation of private land used for commercial purposes without consent. It was a technical maneuver, obscure enough that it might slip past the association's lawyers at first glance, but strong enough to halt their expansion temporarily. For a brief time, it worked. The construction stopped, the notices paused, but the silence that followed was worse. It was the silence of strategy. A week later, a letter arrived not from the HOA but from her mortgage lender, stating that her property's liability status had changed due to pending litigation affecting land value. It was the perfect move. They had turned her defense into a weapon against her. Now her bank considered her a financial risk, and the insurance company soon followed. She found herself surrounded not by enemies but by systems quietly withdrawing their protection. Yet amid the exhaustion, something inside her refused to fracture. The more they tried to erase her, the more tangible her defiance became. She began keeping copies of every communication in labeled binders, mapping the network of deceit that connected the HOA to the county offices and the developers who once owned the land. One evening, while reviewing the files, she noticed something she had missed before. A memo buried within the county's zoning correspondence dated 6 months before her aunt's death, authorizing temporary jurisdiction, adjustment pending re-registration of Morrow Hill Estate. The document was signed not by a county official, but by Walter Finch himself, acting as community liaison. He had been orchestrating this long before she ever arrived. The realization didn't frighten her. It clarified everything. Finch wasn't just enforcing rules. He was trying to complete a project decades in the making, one that required her house to vanish from the map as an independent entity. Standing by the window that night, watching the faint glow from the kiosk outside, Nora understood that the fight was no longer about legal ownership. It was about erasing the last trace of something that once stood outside their system. And as she closed the blinds, she made a quiet promise to herself that she would not only keep her home, but expose the architecture of control that had turned an entire neighborhood into a machine built on fear and compliance. The court hearing that would decide the fate of Nora's home took place on a humid morning in June, the air heavy with that peculiar stillness that precedes a storm. She arrived early, clutching a folder so thick it might have passed for a thesis, filled with every document, every letter, every map she had collected during the long months of warfare disguised as procedure. Finch was already there, speaking quietly with 2 lawyers whose identical navy suits gave them the look of precision instruments. He turned as she entered, offering that same antiseptic smile he had used from the very beginning, a gesture so rehearsed it barely qualified as human. The judge, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, began by summarizing the claims. The HOA accused Nora Hudson of trespassing on land under community easement and failing to comply with mandatory regulations. Nora countered that the association's charter was void, its jurisdiction fraudulent, and its very existence dependent on her property, which it had never legally possessed. The courtroom felt tense, filled with the low hum of air conditioning and the faint rustle of papers that sounded like whispers of doubt. The HOA's attorney spoke first, his voice a carefully modulated performance, portraying Nora as obstinate, unreasonable, a single dissenter standing in the way of progress. He used words like cohesion, community welfare, and uniform integrity, wrapping greed in the language of civility. When it was her turn, Nora rose without notes. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she began to speak. She explained how the association's foundation document, the very paper that granted them power, was signed with a forged signature, her great-uncle's name, falsified to create an illusion of legitimacy. She described the phantom charter, the trust that never existed, and how each amendment since had been built upon that original fraud. Then, from her folder, she withdrew the copy of the 1993 newspaper notice and the microfilm image of the falsified signature, placing them before the judge like relics from a buried crime. The attorney objected, claiming irrelevance again, but the judge silenced him with a single raised hand. Nora continued, her tone gathering strength, and finally produced the discovery that anchored everything. The county memorandum authorizing jurisdiction adjustment, signed by Finch himself years before he became HOA president. "This," she said, her voice clear now, "isn't governance. It's appropriation by paperwork. You've built an empire on my family's name, on land that was never yours to claim. And you've hidden behind language so dense no one dared to read it until now." The judge leaned forward, studying the documents with an intensity that made the courtroom fall silent. Finch shifted in his seat, his composure cracking for the first time. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then the judge spoke, her tone deliberate and final. "Mr. Finch," she said, "I see no record of this trust or its authorization. In fact, the evidence suggests your organization was never legally constituted. The court cannot recognize an entity that has no lawful foundation." The words landed with the weight of a hammer. Finch tried to interrupt, his lawyers scrambling to argue technicalities, but the judge cut them off. "Enough. The plaintiff's claim is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, the court orders a full audit of the association's incorporation and financial history." Nora felt the air leave her lungs all at once, the tension that had wound itself into her muscles finally breaking. For the first time in months, she could breathe without resistance. Finch sat motionless, staring at the table as though the architecture of his authority had just collapsed in silence. When the session adjourned, he approached her in the hallway, his face pale, his voice stripped of its former control. "You think you've won," he whispered, "but you've destroyed the system that held this place together." Nora looked at him steadily, her exhaustion so complete it felt like calm. "No," she said quietly. "I just reminded it where it was built." Outside, the sky had opened, rain falling in heavy sheets that blurred the courthouse steps into a shimmer of gray. She stood beneath the overhang for a moment, watching the water run down the stone, and thought of her house waiting on the hill. The same old walls that had once felt like a burden now transformed into proof of endurance. The fight had stripped away everything unnecessary. Fear, politeness, the illusion of control. All that remained was truth, sharp and unyielding as bedrock, and for the first time she understood what it meant to own something not through a deed or document, but through sheer refusal to give it up. The weeks that followed felt strangely hollow, as though silence itself had become a living thing inhabiting the corners of Nora's house. The court's decision spread through the neighborhood faster than rumor, and the people who once looked at her with cautious smiles now avoided her gaze altogether, ashamed or fearful. She couldn't tell. The HOA office was shuttered within a month, its logo peeled from the glass doors, leaving only faint adhesive shadows in the sunlight. The kiosk they had built on her boundary was dismantled by county order, reduced to a heap of metal that glimmered faintly before being hauled away. Yet victory did not taste triumphant. It was quiet, heavy, and strangely private. The county launched a formal investigation into Finch's conduct, and whispers of embezzlement began to surface, though Nora no longer cared for vengeance. What mattered was that the house, her aunt's house, her family's stubborn monument, was once again hers in every sense that mattered. The yard grew wild again, not out of neglect but freedom, the grass reclaiming the scars left by stakes and tape. At night, she sometimes walked the perimeter with a flashlight, tracing the line of her land, not as a guard, but as someone relearning the shape of safety. One evening, she found the last of the plastic inspection tags caught in a branch, its ink faded to illegibility. She untied it and let it fall into the wet soil, realizing as she did that it was over, not because the system had collapsed, but because she had refused to. In the months that followed, she began cataloging the case, every letter, every motion, every forged line, turning them into a study of linguistic manipulation in property law. Universities wrote to her, asking for lectures. Journalists sent requests for interviews, which she ignored. She didn't want to become a symbol or a headline. She wanted to keep what she had fought for, the right to exist without intrusion. On quiet mornings, she sat on the porch with coffee, watching the mist rise from the valley, and thinking how strange it was that all empires, even the smallest ones, crumble the same way, one misplaced word at a time.